Good morning. My name is Culum Brown, and I'm a professor at Macquarie University here in Sydney. Fish have a serious PR problem when it comes to intelligence. Many people think that fish are mindless automatons, and Dory from Finding Nemo is a classic example of just how silly this idea is. Dory suffers from short-term memory loss. She can't remember where she is, where she's going, where she's been, who her parents are, or anything. So it's even obvious to little kids that a fish that lacked learning and memory capacity would not get by in the real world. The scientific reality is that fish are way smarter than most people think, just as smart and sometimes even smarter than land animals. And here's a list of some of the traits that one might reasonably associate with intelligence. And over the last 10 years or so, all of these behaviours have not only been shown in fishes, but in fact, fish have often led the way as model species in terms of understanding how these mechanisms evolved. Intelligence, sentience, and ethics are often tied together. People are far more likely to show empathy towards animals that they believe are smart, and animals that are smart have a greater capacity to suffer. The gap between the public perception of fish intelligence and scientific reality is a serious problem because it has implications for how we interact with fish, not least of which because public opinion drives animal behaviour, animal welfare legislation. Humans interact with fish in lots and lots of different ways, and all of them have welfare implications. So, for example, they are a major source of protein, the last major source that's captured from wild populations. And of course, fish populations can't cope with the demand of the fishing pressure that we put on them, so aquaculture has rapidly filled that gap. And recreational fishing is an extremely popular pastime and is also a very strong political lobby. Fish are the most popular pet in the world in terms of the absolute numbers. And they're ranked after rats and mice in terms of the numbers used in scientific research. And if you're interested in biodiversity or conservation biology, there are more species of fishes on the planet than all the other vertebrates combined, and many of them are at risk of extinction. One of the controversial topics in fish biology over the last 20 years or more, I suppose, has been the question of whether or not feel pain. Whether fish feel pain. The question is not as simple as it may sound, but the long and the short of it is that the answer is yes. The reason you and I feel pain is because we inherit pain receptors from our fishy ancestors. Nociceptors date all the way back to the annelids. And for those of you who don't know what annelids are, they're the little worms you find on the beach buried in the sand. But the debate is no longer about whether or not they can detect noxious stimuli, but rather how they respond on an emotional level. That is, are they cognitively engaged with pain? Unfortunately, the question of whether fish respond to pain on an emotional level has really become wrapped up in a broader question about whether or not they are conscious or sentient. The trouble is we don't really know what consciousness is, let alone how to measure it. I and others have argued that arbitrarily splitting this idea of nociception from the consciousness and painful perception pathway in an emotional sense is really counterproductive. Really, the detection of the painful stimuli and the emotional response to it, the cognitive response to that, is all part and parcel of the same package, that it all evolved together. Some have argued that because fish brains are different to our own, they can't feel pain in the way that we do. And in the context of pain, it's been suggested that pain perception partially occurs in the human cortex. And since fish don't have a human cortex, because they're fishes, they can't feel pain. Now, of course, that logic presumably applies to all animals. Now, while fish brains develop slightly differently from other vertebrates during ontogeny, particularly the forebrain, All studies of fish brains to date suggest that although structure may be slightly different, they still seem to perform the same functions as all other vertebrates. So the structure function argument just doesn't hold. And to illustrate just how naive this structure function fallacy is, let's take a look at vision as an analogy. Humans also use their cortex to process visual information, and it would be bordering on the ridiculous to suggest that animals that lack a cortex can't see. Fish use different parts of their forebrain, the telencephalon, their optic lobes and cerebellum to process visual information. And over the last 20 years, scientists have recognized that the fish telencephalon, particularly paleo regions, serve similar functions to the mammalian neocortex. In short, our brains are not all that different from a fish brain. They may look slightly different, but the functions are much the same. So the question now becomes a little bit more philosophical. Do fish respond to pain in an emotional or cognitive level in a manner that's similar to humans? Well, this is a much harder question to answer, not just for fish, but for any animal, including ourselves. For humans, we get some idea of how pain is processed in the brain by using MRI. Some parts of the brain light up more than others when humans suffer from pain. The interesting thing, though, is that there's a huge amount of variation between people, not only on how we report pain verbally, but also how our brains respond to pain. And at the moment, there's no legally accepted way to quantify pain in humans. So where does that leave us for quantifying pain in other animals? Now, rather than concentrating on how the human brain processes painful stimuli, let's stop and think for a moment about why we feel pain at all. That is, what's the evolutionary significance of pain perception? What's its function, if you will? Pain perception and the associated emotional responses is an ancient and highly conserved evolutionary trait, and this should not come as a surprise given that its fundamental job is to keep animals safe from harm. And there are two main components. The first is the reflex component. Well, there's no cognition required here. This is just an emergency removal away from the painful stimulus. In fact, the painful stimulus goes to your spinal cord and is reflected back to your muscles to make that happen before you're even consciously aware of it. But the second component, I would argue, is more important. And this has got to do with long-term consolidation of that information. That is, remembering that object X or context Y is dangerous in some way and that you should stay away from it in future. So this is where the cognition and the emotional response to painful stimuli become particularly important. There is literally no sense in detecting painful stimuli if you don't then remember to avoid them again in the future. There has to be cognitive engagement for the system to work. Without cognitive engagement, having just been burnt, you would literally turn around and walk straight back into the fire. The emotional response to painful stimuli, which by definition is pain, is a strong negative reinforcer to ensure that we learn from the experience. And this is where illustrating the cognitive capacity of animals is particularly important from a welfare perspective. Intelligent animals are more likely to suffer from poor welfare because they can remember and anticipate stressful, painful events. In the expression of emotions in man and animals, Charles Darwin described the close connection between human emotions and their evolutionary precursors in animals. Darwin proposed that emotions are adaptive, that they serve to motivate behavior, but also as a form of communication, a means to outwardly express the animal's inner state. Now, for the most part, I suppose, at the fundamental level, emotions guide animal behavior by motivating rewarding behavior and discouraging behavior that results in punishment. Objects or contexts in the world around them vary in emotional salience and valence, which can be edited through life experiences. And in this way, emotions help guide animals through the minefield that is the complex world in which they live. From a neurophysiological perspective, fishes possess the functional equivalents of the limbic and the dopaminergic and nervous systems that are explicitly linked with emotion. They also have dedicated parts of their brain to deal with this kind of information. For example, the medial pallial processes negative emotional memories. And we've known that for quite some time. While the general approach in human psychology is to ask people a bunch of questions and analyze their responses, you can't really do that in animals. In a human, you could say, how much did that hurt? But you could also look for behavioral signs and symptoms of pain. Things like limping, loss of appetite, crying, withdrawal, protecting the injury, and so on. And a child that cannot talk is still obviously capable of experiencing pain, but just can't verbally report it in any kind of meaningful way. And in that case, we're obviously going to rely on observation and evidence, again, these signs and symptoms. To understand animals, you really need to carry out behavioral experiments and let their behavior tell you the story. So, what does the behavioral evidence tell us about pain perception in fishes? Well, this is a table that shows the accepted criteria of animals' capacity for feeling pain. Some of the criteria are clearly neurological, some are physiological, but many are based on behavioral changes that you can observe directly. The main thing I really want to point out here is that the evidence for fishes is just as good as it is for non-human mammals. And in fact, it's better than it is for birds. The behaviors that you can see marked with the red asterisks are ones that are definitely involving higher levels of cognitive processing of painful stimuli. And I'll illustrate some of these with some case studies. But first, let me quickly run through some of the criteria. First, if a fish encounters a painful stimulus, its behavior changes. For example, they might show avoidance, retreat, a loss of appetite, distraction, and so on. If you treat the animal with painkiller, the behavior returns to normal. Fish actively avoid contexts and objects that have been previously associated with painful stimuli, and they are obviously cognitively engaged and remember their painful experiences. If forced to stay in a location where they previously encountered pain, they show signs of fear, stress, and anxiety in anticipation that a negative event will occur again. And fish clearly engage with pain cognitively when they make trade-offs between pain and their various other needs. That is, that they might be willing to pay a cost in terms of pain in order to access things that they really need or want. As they say, no pain, no gain. Here is some of the very early work done by Lynn Snedden, originally when we were both at the University of Edinburgh. And here she injected trout with acetic acid or bee venom in the lips. And you can quite clearly see that the amount of time the fish took to resume feeding was significantly higher in those that were injected with venom or acid compared to a control, which were just handled, or the saline, which were just injected with saline. So it changes from about 80 minutes to almost 3 hours, which is a pretty substantial loss in appetite because of this associated pain. You can also see some other changes in physiology here in this case and behavior. The opercular beat rate down the bottom is about breathing, and activity is obviously how active the animal is in the aquarium. How much does it swim around? And this is changes from a baseline where the 0 here is absolute baseline and the same in the opercular beat rate. You can see what happens to the opercular beat rate and activity under saline, under acid, and a couple of other potential painkillers. But you can see, importantly, that when you provide a local in the form of lidocaine, the behavior begins to approach the control where it's just saline. So their opercular beat rate goes up, their activity goes down when they're suffering from pain, and it returns to normal if you give them a local. Trout were allowed to swim around in this aquarium here, and we have an interesting situation for them, a bit of a conundrum, if you will. On the one side, they have a friend who they obviously want to spend some time with because fish generally are pretty social kind of animals. But in some cases, whenever they entered this part of the aquarium, they got zapped with a small voltage of electricity. Now, the question is, are the fish going to avoid the zap, or are they going to pay a cost in order to access their friends behind the partition? And although this is a bit of a horrendogram, I can walk you through it quite easily. The black is the case where there is no fish, no companion on the other side of the partition. And what you can see is that prior to the zap being issued, they're kind of evenly distributed across the aquarium, about 30% of their time in all three quadrants, which is roughly what you'd expect. And then during the stimulus application and also afterwards, you get to see this really big increase in the proportion of time they spent on the far side. That is as far away from the shock as they can possibly be. Now compare those results to when a friend is on the other side of that partition. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they're attracted to that friend, trying to get as close to they can before the shock is administered. But have a look what happens during the shock and afterwards. And in fact, if anything, they actually increase their preference. And that's because fish, when they're scared, have a very strong compulsion to school. There's safety in numbers. And so even though they're socially attracted initially, after they're scared or injured, that need to be closely associated with their friends increases even further. So clearly, in this case, the fishes are willing to pay a cost, that is the risk of being zapped, in order to access their friends. And a similar version of this experiment has been done when you offer food in the zapped area. And if you starve a fish for 3 days, then eventually they accept the zap in order to access food. Clearly, these sorts of behavioral responses are quite complex. So a quick summary, fish are intelligent creatures. Evolutionary function of pain perception is ancient and are highly conserved in all vertebrates. The neurons for pain perception are present in fish. Brains that control the emotional responses are also present. Fishes are cognitively engaged with pain, that is, they are sentient. Fish show expected behavioral and physiological responses to pain. Painkiller returns behavior to normal, and fish trade off pain for other needs. That is, it's not a reflexive behavior. So the scientific evidence suggests that fish are smart enough to suffer and respond to pain in a way that is similar to us and indeed the rest of the vertebrates. So what are the implications for how we treat them in terms of the broader community? And here are some of the images as to whether or not you think we're doing fish justice in terms of looking after their welfare. What are the implications? Well, let's just think of the sheer number of fishes to start with. And this is just an estimate of how many fishes, individual fishes, are captured by commercial fishing operations each year for human consumption. This does not include bycatch and illegal landings and anything that's not reported to the FAO. So you can see that the estimate is somewhere conservatively between 1 and 3 trillion individuals, compared to 57 billion birds and 3 billion mammals. So by comparison to the terrestrial animals that are killed each year for human consumption, it seems to be quite trivial. I mean, look at those numbers. 405 individual fish killed per person per year, compared to just 0.4 mammals or 7.7 birds. So however you look at it, the welfare impact in terms of just commercial fishing alone is somewhere between 53 and 1,000 times greater than the terrestrial meat production systems. So arguably, the way we treat fishes is the biggest animal welfare issue facing us today. And thank you for listening, and I'm quite happy to take questions. If you want to email me, culumbrown@yahoo.com or culumbrown@gmail.com or culum.brown@mq.edu.au. And thanks for listening.